In today's session, we'll be discussing about climate change agreements and concerns. Climate change is one of the major environmental concerns of many countries in the world. Negotiations to control potential climate changes have been taking place from Rio to Madrid for the last so many years. Scientific analysis have become more and more precise on the likely impacts of climate change. According to the second assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, current trends in greenhouse gases emissions may indeed cause the average global temperature to increase by 1 to 3.5 degrees Celsius over the next 100 years. As a result, sea levels are expected to rise by 15 to 95 centimeter and climate zones to shift towards the poles by 150 to 550 kilometer in mid-latitudes. In this context, countries are negotiating to achieve a worldwide agreement on the greenhouse gas emissions control in order to stabilize changes. Despite the agreement on targets achieved in Kyoto, many issues still remain unresolved. Awareness of climate change as an issue facing mankind and the action to address it are relatively recent phenomena. It was not until the late 1970s, however, that the World Meteorological Organization began to express concern that human activities, notably the emissions of carbon dioxide, might lead to serious warming of the lower atmosphere. Scientific concerns about global warming grew during the 1980s and in 1988, a year when North America faced an intense heat wave and drought. These spilled over into political concerns, and the WMO and the United Nations Environment Programme established the International Panel on Climate Change to investigate and report on climate evidence on the climate changes and possible international responses to the change. The IPCC has been central to the subsequent debates and processes around the development of climate change policies. Its first assessment report in 1990 fed into the drafting of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1991. This was signed by 166 nations at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, and it came into force in 1994. The UNFCCC did not contain any specific national or international targets to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, but it contained key points or principles that have been foundational in the subsequent international climate change debates and processes. It rolled out that the stabilization of climate to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system in a time frame that would allow natural systems to adapt without major damage to food systems and economic development. UNFCCC raises concerns for developing countries and especially those most vulnerable to damaging climate change impacts such as the small island states. The importance of precautionary measures to respond to the severity of climate change threats despite real scientific uncertainties regarding climate change processes and impacts. In the absence of specific targets, the UNFCCC fell short of the aspirations of many environmentalists. However, it was an important step in establishing foundational principles to guide subsequent negotiations over national reductions in the greenhouse gas emissions. These culminated in a conference of parties meeting in Kyoto in Japan. This was the third conference of party which delegates agreed in is what known as Kyoto Protocol. This established developed countries emission targets for 2008 to 2012 and the three main mechanisms for meeting them. By 2007, 2008 and 2009, the existence and dangers of climate change were increasingly recognized with growing scientific evidence. Parallelly, public awareness was concerned and unusual weather patterns were heightened over time. National governments face major difficulties agreeing national contributions to international reductions in global emissions of the greenhouse gases. On one hand, there is widespread recognition that drastic emission reductions are needed. However, governments and most importantly their electorates do not want to bear the cost of such reductions in terms of increased energy costs, investments in new technologies, and infrastructure and lifestyle changes. There are fears that countries with higher emission allowances will benefit from competitive advantage in international trade, while countries with lower emission allowances will suffer disadvantages and hence suffer economically. Rich countries with high emissions per capita face very large economic and social adjustment costs if they are to make substantial reduction in their emissions. Poor countries have lower current emissions per capita but do not want either to be denied opportunities for economic growth and increased standards of living associated with increasing emissions or to be forced down to a more costly and slower development path constrained by keeping down the greenhouse gas emissions. Despite the widespread agreement now, the seriousness of climate change, deep divisions therefore remain between countries with regard to the appropriate distribution of greenhouse gas emission limits and reductions. Complex technical and political challenges continue in developing principles to guide agreement on just and acceptable national emission targets. These challenges posed major problems in the last COPs from Copenhagen in 2009, Cancun in 2010 and Durban in 2011, when negotiations were ongoing for establishing a legally binding treaty for the post-2012 after the first commitment period of Kyoto Protocol. While Copenhagen was a major debacle, Cancun resulted in Cancun agreements which paved the way for a number of important arrangements including Green Climate Fund, the Technology Mechanism, the Cancun Adaptation Framework and the Forest Management Reference Levels. After Cancun, many had hoped that Durban would deliver an agreement for the post-2012 phase. However, it was not possible to agree on key issues such as the binding emission, reduction targets and disappointingly the decision was taken that any global legally binding treaty for emission reductions would be negotiated by 2015 and come into effect by 2020. The Durban Platform for Enhanced Action was established to enable negotiations for a new global agreement for implementation in 2020. This delay of global action from 2012 to 2020 was criticized by NGOs, scientists and some governments as it delays global action to tackle climate change by almost a decade. The second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol started in 2013 and continues until 2017 or 2020 depending upon the negotiations. But emissions reductions are only required from developed countries that signed up to it, thereby excluding major emitters such as US, Russia and Japan and emerging emitters such as China and India. A new global agreement starting in 2020 is therefore crucial to tackle the climate change.